In this video, you'll discover how to use the starving crowd method to grow your podcast audience. So look, what if I told you there is a way to turn your podcast into a magnet for listeners, making them eagerly anticipate every single episode? Imagine having a loyal fan base that not only tunes in regularly, but take every call to action. Now, this might feel like a dream, but I'm telling you, it's more than achievable once you understand this starving crowd principle. So look, my name is Alan Funeri. I'm the co-founder of GetMoreListens.com, a company helping entrepreneurs of podcasts turn a slow growth show into a rapidly growing positive ROI show. Over the last 4 years, I've interviewed and coached 350 plus podcasters, and I'm the co-host of Why Your Podcast Isn't Growing, which generate $10,000 of attributed sales each and every month. Those down there are our best-selling books. So if you're familiar with those, Daniel Larson is a pen name. But again, this isn't about me, it's about you. So let's dive straight in. Because the thing is, most podcasts are stuck in a cycle, struggling to gain new listeners, and even worse, keep those listeners coming back for more. You've probably experienced this when you get bursts of interest, huge influx in terms of downloads, whether that's monthly or per episode basis, but then it's followed by a long, prolonged silence where you're kind of like, well, what the hell is going on? Why have I had this influx? And everyone's kind of like left. And what if I told you that there's a solution that isn't as obvious as most people might think? And no, I'm not talking about spending more time promoting on social media, creating viral content, promotional clips. And no, it's not about getting bigger guests onto your podcast to try to leverage their audience. And it's certainly not churning out more content in hopes that something will eventually stick. It's something different, something that's been wildly successful for those who've actually cracked this code and apply this strategy, apply this specific principle. This is how we've helped clients like Whitney here go from 600 downloads per month to 7,000 monthly downloads 7 months later. She was struggling to grow for 2 years and experienced explosive growth after she implemented these principles. Clients like Ben, who literally went from struggling to hit 30 downloads per episode to now getting 600 plus downloads per episode 90 days after we rebranded his show and fixed his retention issue. And again, I'm going to break down the principle in a second. How we help clients like Laurie, who's now hitting record months after she was hitting pod fade because she didn't understand how to use this principle effectively. And once we showed her how to use this principle, her podcast growth started to head in the right direction, and she's now experiencing consistent growth month after month. Now, this all comes down to this renowned story of a marketer known as Gary Holbert, who once asked his students a simple yet profound question. So here's the story of the starving crowd and how ignoring it as a podcaster guarantees slow podcast growth no matter how hard you try, low podcast engagement even though you produce highly valuable content, and guarantees that even high-profile guests and solo episodes will always fall flat and actually end up repelling new listeners. Again, Gary Holbert was a professor taking a marketing class, and Gary posed this question to his students. If you're opening a hamburger stand, yes, a hamburger stand, you heard it right, hamburger stand, what's the one thing you'd want to guarantee success for this business? Students eagerly answered, all raising their hands, me, you know, maybe I need the best location, the best tasting burgers, the lowest prices, because again, if I have the best location, then it's going to be great because then people are going to come to me easily. If I have the best tasting burger, well, it tastes amazing. So of course, that quality is super, super important. The lowest prices because people want things cheap and easy and simple. The most effective pricing, the most effective advertising, because again, marketing, branding, you know, sales are super, super important. So if I have that, the most effective advertising, that should going to be that guarantees success. So Gary sat, he listened, and then answered by simply shaking his head. And he said, no, that's all good, but there's something much more important. And the students were like, well, what the hell? What are you talking about? How the hell could it be anything more important than having a great, location, having the best pricing, having, effective marketing to actually get people in terms of our pricing? Like, what else could be more important than that? The most important thing is having a starving crowd. No matter how good the burgers are, no matter how good your pricing is, and no matter how good the location is, or even your marketing and advertising, if there is no demand for this hamburger, it just will never succeed. But if you have a starving crowd, even an average burger business will succeed and sell out. Now, why am I telling you this? And what the hell does this have to do with growing your podcast, right? Seems very random. The story emphasizes the power of having a market that has massive demand. When there's a starving crowd, meaning an audience that's in desperate need of a solution or product, product, even a less perfect offering or product can achieve great success. And I think sometimes we as podcasters often forget about this, right? The focus should be on understanding and targeting markets where the demand is high and where the audience are experiencing significant pain, or at least they feel some kind of level of discomfort and have an urgent need. But most podcasts are stuck following a normal content strategy, solely relying on high-profile guests, hoping they'll bring in a new audience. Guessing with a content strategy, covering different topics without doing deep audience research. They lack content market fit, forcing topics on their listeners instead of giving them what they actually want and desire. People just guess. And you might speak to your audience, you might have some ideas, you might invite a guest on, but you're just like, there's no actual strategic approach of deciding what topics to pick. And here are the signs that you're missing a robust content strategy. You're experiencing slow and steady growth, your listenership is in decline, you're experiencing pod fade, new listeners discover your show, love an episode, but they don't love the entire show, so they leave. Listeners don't often take your call to action because the content doesn't hit the sweet spot for them, doesn't influence them enough to, again, take the next step. And how will your growth compound month after month if you can't get listeners coming back for more? And how can you expect listeners to pay you if you can't get listeners to take a simple CTA? They just simply won't. I don't want to sugarcoat this. I want to be very honest in terms of what we see and what we've experienced with our clients and what we see day in, day out with podcasts and what they struggle to grow. People are trying to feed vegetables down their audience's throat when their audience might want something completely different. And that's why we need a demand-based content strategy in order to attract, engage, and retain more listeners who discover your show. A demand-based content strategy is our own way of finding our starving crowd, figuring out what our audience actually want. Here's what it looks like. This essentially means developing a demand-based content strategy based on audience research, planning and structuring episodes around popular topics that's aligned with your audience's demand, establishing consistency, engaging with your audience, and adapting based on feedback. So something that we've done recently with our podcast is, we were experimenting with a new format, and we looked at our retention time on Apple and Spotify. That's the completion rate. On average, how much of our episode do our listeners listen to? These were 40-minute episodes to an hour, so relatively long. And we saw that consistently our retention time was like 50%, which is awful. It should be 80% if you want to get high engagement rate and if you want your content shared to more listeners on Apple and Spotify. So our podcast for podcasters was doing terrible with this new format or with this specific format. So we looked at the data, looked at the feedback from our audience, and we decided to make it 15 minutes and far more focused. And again, our retention time matched the behavior and the consumption habits, the demand that our audience wanted. And when we did that, our retention time increased to now 17-80%, and it's still improving, week after week, because again, we're fine tuning constantly. Another example could be looking at what the most popular episodes or topics that I cover that my audience love. You have a business podcast, but your solo episodes perform exceptionally well. Maybe just focus on solo. It might be that you're guessing right now, and instead of just guessing, you look at Reddit threads, you look at Twitter spaces, you look at Facebook group, you look on YouTube videos and see which videos are currently performing well. What's hot and trending in my industry right now? That's you capturing demand, understanding where the hungry crowd, because your audience are constantly searching and looking for different types of content. So when you can position yourself covering the right content that are hot and trending right now that your audience wants, you're feeding the starving crowd. So here are the key differences when it comes to a normal content strategy versus a demand-based content strategy. A normal content strategy is like opening up a hamburger stand in a location with small or indifferent crowd. You're hoping your content will attract the attention, but demand isn't guaranteed. Whereas a demand-based content strategy is like setting up a stand in the middle of a starving crowd. You're creating content around topics your audience are already craving. This ensures your content is relevant, engaging, and highly demanded, leading to faster growth and a stronger audience loyalty. You're giving them what they want. This is a totally different approach and has been wildly successful for our clients. Here are some benefits. You deeply understand your audience needs without the guesswork. You build a highly engaged listener base who jump off their seats just to take your call to action. You attract new listeners who binge your content and are itching for new episodes to drop. You become one of a kind show that gains traction fast by providing highly targeted and relevant content to your audience and your market and the listeners. And you have listeners begging you to take their money when you tease the idea that you have a product dropping soon. That is the power of properly executing a demand-based content strategy and feeding the starving crowd. By aligning your content strategy with the needs and desires of your audience, you can replicate the success of the hamburger stand in a starving crowd, ensuring that your efforts are met with eager and enthusiastic listeners. And that's how we use the starving crowd method to grow your audience, and why ignoring it only leads to a slow growth podcast.